Legendary Pokemon are supposed to be, well, legendary. Many of them are in the Ubers tier, where they are banned from standard play, known as the OU tier. Competitive singles Pokemon is organized into a tier system. That way, even if your favorites aren't good in the OU tier, you can still use them in a lower tier where it's matched up against Pokemon of a similar power level. These tiers are created based on usage statistics, with the idea that the Pokemon that are used the most must be the best. The main tier is the OU tier, where anything too strong from OU gets banned to the Ubers tier, the tier of Legendaries. PU is the lowest official tier. Most Legendaries and mythical Pokemon are seen either in Ubers or the OU tier, but some mythicals and Legendaries are so bad they're in the PU tier, and then there are some mythicals that are so bad that they're actually below the PU tier. We're going to talk about every legendary or mythical Pokemon that sucks in competitive Pokemon. First we have Articuno. Normally the answer for why Articuno is bad is because of Stealth Rock, but in Generation 8, Articuno can use the item Heavy Duty Boots to be immune to Stealth Rock, yet it's still really bad. This is partly because even though it has Heavy Duty Boots, Knockoff is an incredibly common move, which means Articuno constantly has to be careful of losing its Heavy Duty Boots. More fundamentally though, while its stats are decent enough, it has no way to break past Steel types, which is a big problem considering that Steel is one of the best types in the game and is therefore extremely common. Because of that and its relatively low special attack, it gets used as a defensive Pokemon with moves like Defog, Roost, Toxic, Heal Bell, or Haze. But even then, even though Articuno has good defensive stats, Ice is not a good defensive typing, and Articuno doesn't resist very many attacks. Heavy Duty Boots was supposed to save Articuno, but the truth is that its stats are built to be a defensive tank, but its typing is not, and Articuno is both too weak to be a good offensive Pokemon, and has too bad of a defensive typing to be a good defensive Pokemon. Next we have Calyrex's base form. Calyrex is weak to U-turn and Knockoff, two of the most common moves in the game. It also doesn't have a good ability, nor does it have reliable recovery. It's one of the few legendaries whose stats are average at best, and doesn't have anything that stands out. No good moves, typing, or ability. There are so many grass types which have something special about them, but Calyrex only has a Specs Leaf Storm to throw off. Ultimately, Calyrex is just too average of a Pokemon. Next we have Regice. Regice is similar in some ways to Articuno, but different in others. Regice's huge special defense makes you think it would be a wall, but its ice typing once again makes it not a very good one, just like Articuno. But, unlike Articuno, Regice doesn't get any recovery moves and would have to rely on using Rest and Sleep Talk. It's even worse than Articuno at being a defensive Pokemon. However, Regice does get good coverage moves like Thunderbolt and Focus Blast. So, Regice's main set, when it's used, is a Rock Polish Sweeper with potentially even a Weakness Policy or Life Orb. Its defense is still relatively low though, so it would have to try and set up on a special attacker. However, Regice is still just too weak and too slow to be a good offensive Pokemon. Even in the ideal world where you're able to set up a Rock Polish, many Pokemon can live a Regice attack easily, and many Choice Scarf Pokemon can still outspeed Regice because it's so slow. Just like Articuno, it's betrayed by its ice typing. Next we have Regigigas, which should surprise nobody. Regigigas is the poster child for an awful legendary, and it's mainly because of the ability Slow Start. Regigigas even got the move Protect and Rest in Generation 8 to help stall out turns, but it's not enough. Regigigas is mostly useless while it's trying to get going, and you have to invest a lot of effort into keeping it healthy for 5 turns in order to reach its potential. Even then, it's not like you automatically win the game if you do, you just get a very decent Pokemon. You often have to use paralysis spam strategies in order to create an environment where Regigigas can try and substitute spam effectively and waste enough turns to get going. When discussing Regigigas, it's useful to think of a concept known as opportunity cost. When you use Regigigas, you are not just using Regigigas, you are also taking up a spot for something that could have been more consistent or useful. Instead of using a team spot for something that needs a lot of risk and investment for only a moderate return, you could have used it on another more reliable sweeper, or maybe even a choice-banded destroyer or utility Pokemon. When you think about it from that perspective, it becomes very difficult to justify using Regigigas on your team. It just costs too much for too little reward. Next we have Silvally, which is interesting because some of its better types like Steel are even NU, but some of its worst types like Bug are below PU. But generally, why are Silvally forms not good, especially when multi-attack was buffed to an incredible 120 base power? Similar to Calyrex, having distributed stats means it's not great at any one thing. Also, it doesn't have a good ability and can't hold an item. That's 2 sources of power it's missing out on. Offensive sets like Swords Dance, Flame Charge, Multi-Attack Silvally look good on paper, but are just too weak in higher competition, especially without a boosting ability or item. Defensive sets with Parting Shot or Defog look good as well, but because Silvally doesn't have reliable recovery, it struggles with longevity, which is something you need for a defensive Pokemon. Next we have Uxie, which is honestly not that bad. Unlike Mesprit or Azelf who are more offensive, Uxie just sits there. This isn't inherently bad though. Uxie can still Stealth Rock, Knock Off, U-Turn, Memento, or Yawn. Basically, it's a defensive Stealth Rocker pivot. The problem is that there are a lot of good defensive Stealth Rockers and many of them with reliable recovery, unlike Uxie. They're also not weak to Knock Off, a common attacking move. In fact, Psychic isn't really a great defensive typing. Uxie is cursed with good defensive stats but with a bad defensive type. Uxie has a very specific role of being a bulky Psychic-type pivot Stealth Rocker that wants to feint itself with Memento. This makes Uxie unique because even though it's below PU, it can still be used in even OU in the right circumstance. It's just that that circumstance is rare and the demand for that very specific role is low. This is something you can't say about Regice though. Regice doesn't have any circumstance where it would be good in OU. Now we move on to the legendaries in the PU tier. Still the lowest official tier, but at least it has a tier. Articuno-Galar is actually one of the best Pokemon in PU. By PU standards, it's a strong special attacker that can use either a heavy-duty boot set or a choice spec set. But the reason that it doesn't translate well to higher tiers is that it fundamentally doesn't have coverage and can't break past Pokemon that resist it, just like Articuno. Its offensive stats are great for a PU context and justifies its usage, but in higher tiers with stronger walls and better psychic types as competition, it doesn't make sense to use an offensive Pokemon that can get completely shut down by anything that resists it. Even Indeedee is a better option because it has psychic terrain and moves like Mystical Fire to hit steel types. Glastrier is probably the most shocking Pokemon on this list because it's actually really good in VGC doubles, but in singles it struggles for many of the same reasons that Regice struggles. It's a slow ice type without any recovery. It's an absolute horse with huge bulk that's much more distributed than Regice, but the speed is such a killer. Even if Glastrier can win 1v1 versus something, it would take enough damage that it would get revenge killed next. It's impossible to understate the importance of the speed stat. Even walls can outspeed Glastrier, which is incredibly problematic because that means they can use status moves like Will-O-Wisp. Trick Room is an obvious solution, but in singles, Trick Room isn't a great strategy because it only lasts 5 turns and you have to spend a few of those turns actually getting your attackers like Glastrier into the game. Glastrier is definitely better than a Pokemon like Regice because its mixed bulk makes it difficult to one-hit KO. In a PU context, it can 1v1 a lot of the tier, but it's still underwhelming, especially because PU is dominated by Jellicent. Ultimately though, Glastrier has decent stats and move pool, but it's just way too slow for an offensive Pokemon, especially without a recovery move. Mesprit is like a more offensive version of Uxie, while still not being as offensive as Azelf. The best way to describe Mesprit is that it will never be the best at anything. It's neither extremely offensive nor is it extremely defensive. It also doesn't have reliable recovery. It can use Nasty Plot, but it's outsped by a lot of Pokemon and struggles versus Steel types, unlike Azelf who is fast and has Fire Blast. As you can tell, it's a reoccurring theme that defensive Pokemon need recovery moves and offensive Pokemon need to be either extremely strong or have ways to beat their type mismatches. Mesprit doesn't have any of those. Still, the speed is valuable enough in a PU context and it can be a decent wall breaker or offensive stealth rocker. If Mesprit or even Uxie had Recover, it would be totally different Pokemon. One advantage that Mesprit has over Uxie is that it has Healing Wish and overall Mesprit's speed makes it more valuable than Uxie. Regirock is a physical counterpart of Regice. While Rock is not a great defensive typing either, and not having recovery is a death sentence for most defensive Pokemon, Regirock at least has Stealth Rock and a move like Body Press to hit steel types. The main problem is that there are just better options as a defensive Stealth Rocker. Using a ground type on a team is basically mandatory to stop Volt Switch. If you use Regirock as your Stealth Rocker, that means you have to find a ground type somewhere else, which is not always easy. It's far easier to just use, for example, Mudsdale as your physical wall, which is similar to Regirock but with a better typing and ability. Even with an apples to apples comparison of rock types, it's hard to justify using Regirock instead of something like Tyranitar or Rhyperior. Even Diancie is considered a better defensive rock type because of its useful fairy typing. But these are the legendary and mythical Pokemon that are just not very good in competitive Pokemon. And if you've made it this far in the video, consider subscribing and let me know down in the comments below if you like this type of longer content.